So our context today is really looking at the subject of creationism and evolution. The whole study that this whole world has been caught up in this whole debate around is, did God create the world in 6 days, or was it natural selection, which is evolution? And really the thing that gave mind to all of this, the reason why we're talking about it is because a man by the name of Charles Darwin years ago, around 1844, gave rise to, wrote a book. The name of the book was known as The Origin of Species. And in that book, he had titled or spoke about a number of things. One, natural selection, which talks about how basically nature over time began to evolve and eventually gave rise to different species and things like that. And within that is also the age of the earth. And through his study, it's almost as if the world has been in existence for millions and millions of years. In some cases, even scientists point out that it could have been existing for billions and billions of years. And this obviously gives rise to the reason why we are having the study, and I think it's fundamental that we do so in the time that we're living in. I just want to make sure that we all understand it's not going to be a very, it's going to be insightful, it's going to be interesting. At the same time, it can be quite technical. I We have functionality where you can raise your hand in case you feel like maybe I'm speaking something that, and maybe we'll take the questions at the end of it. But I think it's important we all walk on the same page. So, and maybe the other reason why we are talking about this thing is that, think about it logically. If you have children, your children spend more time at school awake than they do awake at home. So if your children spend more time awake at school, who is doing more of the education, you, the parent, or the school? I take it the school. So if the school is doing more educating to your child, then the fundamental basis of your child's education is based on who is spending more time with your child from an educational point of view. Now, with that said, now of this, so if the persons are the persons that are doing the educating to your children are in themselves not necessarily Christian, or the content of their education is not based on Christian principles, what then happens to your child's subconscious underlay in terms of understanding how this world works, and even their frame around spiritual matters will fundamentally be flawed, because they are being educated from a worldview that is not biblical, but from a worldview that's opposite from what the Bible teaches. And that's why I think it's important for us to understand how heavy it is, how heavy a burden we bear as parents and or as teachers of from church, that we understand that more than anything else, we every single night we always have to try by all means to start detaching those things which are not fundamentally Christian in nature, because all the things that our children get to hear on a day-to-day basis are not in their fundamentalness, or their very nature in itself is not from a Christian worldview. And that's why we are talking about this thing. Okay, so from Christian's perspective, things are very easy, things are very straightforward. In the beginning, God. In the beginning, God. In the Genesis 1 verse 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens, and God created the heaven and earth. So in other words, and the Bible says nothing that was created without him. That's in the book of John. So in other words, everything we see on this earth was created by God. Nothing in this world or in the heavens or in the universe that exists has not, according to the Christian, has been created by God, which simply tells us that there is a supernatural being who is involved in the creation of everything we see around us. Yeah. So supernatural being, and that supernatural being is known to be God, who he in himself is the intelligent designer of everything that we see. He is the intelligent designer of everything that we see. So now, by reading this text, you come to a conclusion, or two conclusions. The first conclusion is that, okay, maybe before I get to the conclusions, the first thing you begin to understand is that God comes from somewhere and enters into what we call our time to begin our time. So in the beginning, God comes from wherever he's coming from, and he begins time for our immediate heaven and our immediate earth. So then time begins for Umuntu at Genesis 1 verse 1. So time for this earth begins from Genesis 1 and continues. So which also tells us that there's a difference in this thing called time. So God exists in his own time and we exist in our time. So that's what we call when we talk about time, we talk about two natures of time. We talk about chronos time, which is our chronological time, the order of things. We exist in time, seconds, hours, and so on. God, however, exists outside of that time. He's not bound by time. That's why he sees the end from the beginning, the beginning from the end. So God comes out of that, what we call, so there's chronos time, and God's time is not chronological time. So he comes out of that other time to then have his sway on the time that we exist in. So it's kankulunkulu asifane sethu. So when we look at this whole thing, we begin to, one of the first things that come up is that within this origin of species and this whole evolution theory, by the way, it's called a theory, man becomes the center of the problem as well as time, the calculation of time as to how long was the creation. Now, from a Christian's point of view, we believe within 6 literal days. Scientists believe that Umhlaba evolved over millions and millions of years. That's where we see it now. And so it creates a problem, number one, for understanding where man comes from. It also creates a problem for understanding where the earth was formed and how the earth was formed. So that's why C.S. Lewis in the book Mere Christianity says something very interesting. He says, for the better half of 6,000 years, man has been trying to prove whether God exists. And he says in this book, yet he is. Yeah, God either most certainly does exist or God most certainly does not exist. And that's what we are going to talk about now. God either most certainly does exist or God most certainly does not exist. There's no middle ground. Whatever. It's either God does exist or God does not exist. It's just twofold. Yeah. And we can't be caught in the middle. Yes, he does exist, and that's what I believe, and that's what we're going to be talking about now. But in the same breath, we need to clear the air. It's either he exists or he does not exist. So we can't be in the middle ground. So you can't be a Christian who also believes in evolution. I hope that makes sense. But and you can't be an evolutionist who also believes in God. So these two don't work together. So it's either or. You can't be caught up in the middle. It's either God fundamentally most certainly does exist or God most certainly does not exist. And that's the premise, and that's where we're operating from. Okay. And then John Calvin says the founder of the Calvin of the church, yes, John Calvin or Baptist, he says no man can survey himself. Now I want us to listen to this. This is what John Calvin says. He says no man can survey himself without forthwith turning his thoughts toward God. If you look at yourself in the mirror, you can't look at yourself in the mirror and not think and not have your thoughts turned towards God, in whom he lives and moves, because it is perfectly obvious, he says, that the endowments which we possess cannot possibly be from ourselves. Your nose, your eyes, your everything. Most bases are when you really spend time looking at yourself in the mirror, you begin to realize that the endowments which we possess cannot possibly be from ourselves. Nay, he says that every being is nothing else than a substance in God alone, or has the subsistence in God alone, meaning they have their origin from God alone. Most biggie listening, you can't help but recognize the power and the omniscience and the awesomeness of God by looking at yourself in the mirror. And then he continues to say, how detestable, I ask you, is this madness, that man finding God in his body and a soul 100 times on this very pretense of excellence denies that there is a God. I want to call themselves scientists or people who don't believe that there is a God. When they look at themselves in the mirror, they admire this very creation, and in their admiration still deny that there is a God. in that very sense be able to then deny that there is a God. When you look at yourself in mirror, imagine if your hair was sitting in another place. Imagine if your head was in another place. Imagine if your ear was in another place. I mean, everything seems to fit unique. It simply tells you that whoever was designing man designed him intelligently. There's this form of intelligent design that's involved in the creation of man. Just think about if your feet were something, that would show that there's no specific design, but how our symmetry, our very structure, everything about us shows that there is what we call supernatural design. Someone else once asked the question, look at your skin. If you look at your skin, can you tell me where your skin starts? You can't. I was no good but your skumba is there. For the mere fact that your fingerprints do not match any other person's fingerprints on this planet Earth, tells you that this is amazing. This is unique. Kabanga, this little balls that are in between the two sockets of your face can see the amount of colors or pixelations that no other camera can do, but you're able to see these colors in clarity, and it doesn't make sense. These small things can see in such a distance and so on. It's amazing. It simply tells amandla kaNkulunkulu. For the mere fact that your nose breathes and all these things that are contained in between your body or inside your body all function to ensure that you are alive and you can do whatever you're doing. All these things simply tell of the awesomeness of God. Now, don't lie. All of us have something we admire about ourselves. Most biggest believe there's something that you admire about the power of God, and his creation is power. Because that's how God works. And everything seems to work in order. Everything has its laws. Nothing sits outside of its place. But God has ensured that everything that we possess is as he had created. Now, to begin to unravel this thing, now I'm going to be a bit scientific around all of these things we are talking about, because we are talking really about this thing called evolution. We're trying to debunk this thing called evolution versus what we hold dear as creation. Yes. One of the ways that we can tell that we really come from God is through what we call our DNA. DNA. Maybe just to explain what DNA is. DNA is what we call a molecular structure that determines how cells work. In fact, every one of us, we have millions and millions of cells in our bodies. Inside every cell is as a DNA. So a DNA is basically made up of four distinct what we call amino acids or nucleotides. So 4 nucleotides, they're A, T, C, G, and those then make up what we call amino acids, and those amino acids have over 100,000 proteins, which then determine, it's almost like a language that tells how your eyes are going to look. So every single cell would then determine how your eyes are going to look. So every cell has a lot of these. And for you to be able to read and understand your DNA, it would take you literally 94 years just to understand the language of your particular DNA. It would literally take you 94 years to study your particular DNA. So just to explain it quite well again, so we have these 4 amino acids. So it's just take them as alphabets, A, T, C, G. They like what we call a Morse code. You would know that whenever someone clicks a couple of times, you'd know what alphabet it is. And for you to then, those alphabets would then make up what we call 26 letters. Those 26 letters eventually make up words. And the random selection of those words could make up what we call sentences, so that you can better understand, or language in this case. So in Morse code language, we have specific dots and dashes and spaces, which makes Morse code symbols. Those Morse code symbols then make up what we call 26 letters. Those 26 letters then make up words, which when you select any of those words, it then gives rise to what we call sentences, and people can understand. So picture that in the sense, Yoguti, when you look at your own DNA, these nucleotides, amino acids, and proteins then make up decide what decide or create a language to decide how certain things are going to look. So there's a language that determines how your eyes are going to look. There's a language that determines how your ears are going to look. There's the language that determines how long they're going to be, how your eyes are going to be, how your eyelashes are going to be, how your what. So all of that is built into your system all throughout every cell. There's what we call DNA. So DNA is the language that determines how everything is going to look like. I hope that makes sense. So DNA is one that tells how things are going to look. So within every cell, these molecular structures determine how everything is going to look. Uzobukeka unjani, in other words. I hope that makes sense. So, and for there to be what we call DNA, for there to be what we call language, one needs intelligence. And it's a natural fact. It's a natural fact that, or it's a scientific fact for that matter, that you can't have language unless you have intelligence. Ukuze language, there has to be some understanding of a language, or someone needs to comprehend that language for it to be understood. So Amasocha, for instance, need to have some form of intel or understanding of how the Morse code works for them to be able to signal to each other how things need to be. And God has built in this language in every single one of us. And it's almost like an imprint. Nama scientists themselves to say, hey guys, if you you must know that I have built a language that determines everything and how things function in everyone's body. And scientists are only now trying to figure out how the language works. They've not fully comprehended how, or they don't still fully comprehend how the language or the DNA language works. So again, it just shows how powerful and how amazing God is. In the very nucleus of our cells, God has imprinted a language that determines how things function, that determines how things are going to be. And really, when you look at it, this DNA forms part of all the natural beings or Ilwane and so on that God has created. And within every natural animal, umuntu and so on, these DNA, this thing called DNA is the subject or is the foundation of how things work in every single creation. I hope that makes sense. So within the DNA, there's also what we call, now I hear a lot of people asking questions around how then does DNA work? DNA can also determine what type of skin color tone you can be. As an example, DNA can be, okay, you can have something like, let's say me and my wife are married. Okay, we are married. Okay, my wife and I are married. And she has she has a DNA. She has A, B, B. She has A, and B, B. I have a capital letter A and a small letter A. I have a capital letter B and a small letter B. Now, as you can see, these two sets in themselves are different. Yagankoskas are made up of capital letters only. It's with one capital letter, one small letter, one capital letter, one small letter. When me and my wife combine, this DNA will then work on, okay, if there are strong genes here, then we will most probably use some of the strong genes and combine, and then eventually in their combination, it will then give rise to some form of color. So let's say if my dominant cells within this thing called melanin, by the way, is the one that determines by what type of skin color. So within that cell, the DNA will then decide what color skin tone is it going to be. And it's looking at the very substance, the DNA that my wife and I produce. So you can find that in some families, ungathola ukuthi komunye imindeni ithola ukuthi your father baba nomama basendaweni eyodwa, but njengoba bashada, within their family they can have a family that has different skin tones of people. For instance, in my family, umfowethu is light-skinned, very light-skinned. My sister is in between. I am much darker than both of them. And that is determined by the nature of DNA. So DNA then determines how. Now, that's why ability over time, okay, in Kumbula, when you study history from the Genesis sense or from the Bible, uNkulunkulu lesikhathi adalu Adam no Eva, He created Adam and Eve, and Adam and Eve had Seth, Cain or Abel, and then you discover Cain then had a wife. So lo wife umthathe. And for you to find out where Cain got the wife, you then begin to understand and read further. And when you read further, you begin to understand that actually Adam and Eve had other children, had other sons and daughters, which then means Cain would have taken one of the daughters Zaga Adam or Eve as a wife. So in other words, Cain would have married her sister. So Cain would have married her sister, and both Cain and the sister would then give birth to children. Né? And within that DNA, would then give rise to other children and so on. Bazofuzukano, Abel, and so on and so forth as it goes along. But eventually, over time, what does in here? I second your brother, you'll marry your sister or your cousin. So no more. You'll go find a partner somewhere else in Tlabin and not close to your family. And I'll explain why that is the case. Just imagine if DNA ka Cain nonkosikazi wakhe is messed up, ne? Because of alcohol over time. Now, obviously, good Adam and Eve's DNA was on point, and they gave birth to Cain. And obviously, the DNA becomes weakened because nature, because of sin, moshega over time. Now, as time progresses, you must realize that the DNA becomes weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker. Now, if you continually are going to share weak DNA, and no two, you come from the same set, and no two, you suffer from the same diseases, while someone more distant from you, now after Cain and Abel, Cain might get to shut and eventually what we call the Tower of Bible, confuse languages abantu, and people were scattered all across the world. Now some would eat right, others would not be going through some change in emzimbeni wabo, but some genes would be healthy, some DNA would be healthier than the others. So uNkulunkulu eventually then stopped intermarriage between brother and sister, wathi kumele manje uyofuna elsewhere. And the reason why God did that is pretty much biological. In that sense, God was saying, now I don't want us to continually carry weak seed or weak DNA all throughout our generations, but you will always find another DNA set outside of yourself so that you can almost encourage stronger DNA formulations within the families. I hope that makes sense. So you're going to shut a distant person from me. Ultimately, all of us originate from Adam and Eve. So I just married a distant cousin of mine, a very, very distant cousin of mine, but we're actually family. We're actually related. But there's a distance. That distance is made by the fact that from separation Cain and so on, and the separation of the Tower of Bible, a lot of us were scattered abroad. But eventually, the cells that we have together from a DNA perspective, there's some strong cells in me, there's some strong cells in my wife, and when we give rise to children, they fundamentally look different from either myself or my unkosikazi, but there's something that tells about both of us, and that's what we are talking about here as well. So the makeup of DNA is the language then that decides how things are going to be. And again, it's a mystery, scientists. Until today, it's become a huge study for scientists, and that just shows how the power of God works throughout this whole thing. DNA just shapes everything. Now, what about the eye? I'm going to talk about certain things that exist in Umuntu, which then show amandla nobukhulu bukaNkulunkulu. One of those things is the eye. Did you know ukuthi umntwana mayise siswini sikamama evalekile phakathi esiswini sikamama ukuthi khona into efikayo emzimbeni walowo mntwana engabonakali, nabo scientists yaba confused ukuthi on a specific month within the pregnancy yomntwana esiswini sikamama kuba nento evula iline la amehla khona, because normally ivalekile, kuba nento evula iline la amehla khona. And mayivula iline lapho bese kwenzeka lento ekubizwa ngokuthi ama-eyelids, so that your eyes can then open and you can see. Kodwa akwaziwa ukuthi lento ibuyaphi, and scientists till today cannot tell. I'm going to show you a short video that speaks about this. A man by the name of Louis Gigolo takes us through this. Just have a listen.
In the womb, miracles happening every moment. Here you are at 5 months in the womb. You remember those days? Those were the good old days. And just miracles happening every moment. Here you are at 5 months in the womb. You remember those days? Those were the good old days. And just miracles happening every second. Let me tell you about one. Million optic nerve endings left the optic nerve center of your brain in the womb, headed for 1 million optic nerves that had left your eye. And they had to meet and match their exact partner, 1 million looking for 1 million. And when they found their exact partner out of 1 million and matched up together, in that instant you had sight. And anyone would tell you that to this moment, the most technologically advanced thing on planet Earth is your eye. Oh, but it didn't do you any good, because when that moment happened, you just had one piece of skin completely covering your eyeball. But as I read in one textbook, miraculously and mysteriously at about the 6th month, a little for the very first time in your mother's womb. You are fearfully and wonderfully made. And the God of the heavens is the one who fashioned you together. And he knows your name tonight. And he knows every single thing there is to know about you. And he's made you a promise that for those who trust in him, he will literally hold them in his hand and carry them all the days of their life.
Just imagine that no one can see this thing, but it happens inside the womb. Now, I want us to go back to the whole issue of science and this whole thing called evolution. There's actually 2 types of science. One is what we call observational science, and the other one is called historical science. Now, when we talk observational science is a field of science where controlled observations cannot be done in order to study cases and effects. Studies are simply done through observation of nature, taking its course and recording the findings over time. So in other words, observational science is saying to, and as an example, you can see, we want to study how clouds form, and so what they say is that from an observational point of view, we can see water rising through precipitation, and that then forms up to then eventually create clouds. And eventually when it becomes heavy, they let loose and eventually becomes rain. That's observational science. That gives rise to a theory around, or laws as to how Amafo or Imvula comes into being. However, for science to be complete, it needs to take hold of both observational as well as historical science. Now, when we refer to theories around creation and how the world came into being, we need to take cognizance of both observational science and as well as historical science, because historical science tells you that, okay, if we believe this is what happened. So when we look at the world, it seems as if there's intelligent design. We can see, this world was created through a supernatural being who decided how this world needs to take form. If that's what we believe from an observational science, historical science tells us or asks us a question: is there a historical document that records how things happened at the beginning? And if so, was there anyone who was present who viewed everything as it happened? From an evolution perspective, no one was there when the Big Bang happened. No one was there when matter gave rise to to all these things that they're talking about now. We can safely say from an observational point of view, yes, we see the things as we see them. We see our bodies. We see all these things taking place. And it tells us that there is a creator, someone who created the world, someone who created the world in 6 days. Is there historical science validation that tells us that historically this thing happens? Yes. We have a Bible that proves that everything transpired. And more importantly, was there a person when all this happened? Yes, there was. And that person is the supernatural being, or this theistic God we believe in, whose name is God. Unkulunkulu was present when everything happened, and that's why there is a book that testifies of what transpired when we were not there. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So from an evolutionary point of view, their theory is flawed on the basis that there's no historical science basis to uphold their theory of evolution. On our side, for what we believe, from a creationist point of view, there's both observational science and there's both historical science that proves the validity of creation. I hope that makes sense. So we hinge on this too, because we fundamentally believe, and here is a record that explains how everything transpired. And more, when you look at the biblical record and how everything lines up, it makes absolute sense. One of these days, I'll be presenting to you how archaeology proves the Bible. And we can talk a lot about Noah's Ark. And when you look at the flood, Noah, all these sedimentary layers and things like that prove that everything could have happened through the flood. So the Grand Canyons and all these things we are seeing now today is not based on some evolutionary process and the Big Bang theory or whatever ice age they're telling us. All this transpired through the flood. And so the Bible seems to trace and seems to link up all the things we are confused about and makes it very clear for everyone to understand. Because from a historical sense and from an observational sense, everything seems to line up and make some sense. Thank you. So Genesis, again, referring to time. So God exists outside time through what we call kairos and not chronos, because chronos refers to us. And the world's history, according to the Bible, began at creation, which means when you study the Bible, you'll realize that at the beginning, on day 6 uDala, which is 5 days before Adam. So Adam, the world is 5 days old, or the earth is 5 days old. Then when you begin to count from Adam, now this is where common sense needs to reign. When you begin to count from Adam, that's why in the Bible has laid out what we call the chronologies of all these people that we read about. So Zofundo to Adam appeal 900 and something years. Then you add the following character 900 and something years. Eventually, when you begin to put all that together, we are in between what we call 6,000 years. And it makes sense to actually show you that the earth in itself is a young earth. It's not a millions and millions and billions of years old, but it's a young earth in the sense that when you count, besides the 5 days as before Adam, but when you count from Adam onwards up until our present day, it tells you that this earth is pretty young. Okay, so just by using the Bible as a historical document, you are able to tell how young the earth is. Okay, now I want to introduce this whole idolatry thing, because it's going to make sense as we conclude the study going forward. Idolatry in the Bible is usually defined as worship of any cult image, idea, object, as opposed to the worship of a monotheistic God, ascribing to objects the attributes of volition, consciousness, and life. So in other words, what is idolatry? Idolatry is saying, Konza is Tom. For instance, Mobega is Tombe Mary, and you worship his Tombe Mary. Lesos Tombe as Kulumi, lesos Tombe as Pili, lesos Tombe as Senziluto. You attribute lifelike qualities to that thing, Engapili, and you rely upon it for your day-to-day living. So idolatry is looking at matter, and saying to matter, you are the one who is responsible for me. So when you look at matter, you're saying matter is responsible for life. When you begin to say matter is responsible for life, that in itself becomes a form of idolatry. I know I've just made a very strong statement. When we begin to ascribe matter as the basis for creation, as the basis for life, we are saying, we are attributing to matter volition, consciousness, and life, and even intelligence. So what do I mean by what I'm saying? Okay, ngicela ubheke around you. You might have a chair around you. Isitulo, ne? So let me tell you what science has been telling us. Science is telling us that matter gave rise to consciousness, or matter gave life to life. Yeah. So we met all around you is chairs, tables, and things like that. As pili lezi zinto. There are speakers, there's a chair, mosbamba lestulo as kali, as kulumi, as tandi, as izondi, because it's fundamentally matter. So if you hold the chair, if you hold the table, most squeeze as kali, asithi ngibamba kabuhlungu, asithi ngiyakuthanda, asithi ngiyakuzonda, because it's matter. It cannot think, it cannot touch, it cannot hold, it cannot love, it cannot do anything. So science tells us that one day, some millions and millions of years ago, these two metaphysical properties, let's just say itulo, zavele zachayisana, there were thousands of these whatever protons, zavele zachayisana ekuchayiseleni kwabo, then eventually over time it gave rise to this earth, kwaze kwavela nathi, kwavela nezinye iy'lwane over time, and these things began to throughout time they began to change. Ezinye zaqala ziyimfene, eventually it gave rise to us. Ne? Now there's a reason why I went through the issue of DNA, because I want to get somewhere. So kwaqala kwaba imfene, then over time zathi makuhamba isikhathi lemfene yafunda ukukhuluma kangcono, eventually yagcina seyifana nathi, eventually yagcina iyithi. I want us to be very clear. Now when we look at DNA seems to oppose all of that. And this is why. Ne? Imfene ine DNA yayo. Ne? And for imfene to turn into a human being, the very DNA imfene ukuze ube umuntu ayikwazi ukuba umuntu, because the DNA yemfene cannot change into any other thing. It cannot instruct the cells to become any other thing except for imfene, because the DNA language fundamentally speaks to ubumfene and not to human being. Okay, so that's why you don't see imfene namhlanje turning into human beings, because fundamentally the DNA yomuntu or DNA yemfene still speaks to ubumfene, because that's the language it was designed to behave, or that's how it was designed to behave. For ukuthi umuntu aphenduke, for ukuthi imfene iphenduke umuntu, imfene leyo would need to have i-DNA yomuntu, and outright none of the animals or none of the beings emhlabeni have DNA outside of itself. Okay, umuntu yeah, but why ke kuba khona abantu abamhloshana kunathi and so on and so forth. I did explain that your DNA could have a capital B or capital C and a small c or capital B and so on, but those are the ones that determine the nature or the lightness of your skin or how long your hair is going to be. But all of that still keeps you as a human being. It doesn't change you to something else. Hence, Mfene will always remain Mfene, because the DNA fundamentally Mfene is kept as Mfene. It cannot speak any other language but than that of Mfene. And that's how nature always behaved. And one of the reasons why, which is scientific by the way, is that everything in nature exists within what we call laws of nature. And those laws of nature govern how nature behaves, including ourselves. So these things, by the way, we are taught by scientists. There's what we call laws of nature. If the law of gravity were to ignore its laws, what would happen? Yeah, we would not have gravity. And so it can't be, which means everything in this world is kept together by laws, and everything in this world is kept by laws. Everything in the universe is kept by laws. Even our very natural being, biological being, a physiological being is kept together by laws. Those laws also determine how far certain things can go. I can only change your skin. I can only change your skin color. I can change your eyes. I can change this. I can change that. But I can't change you into any other fundamental being, because your DNA speaks a particular language related to you as a being. And I hope that makes sense. So when we speak idolatry, we are saying these lifeless things then give rise to life, and it can't happen like that, because it would take literally, it would take some form of intelligence to create umuntu ofana nami. Nangibona muhle kanjani, handsome. It needs some form of intelligence to design where my eyes are going to sit, how big they're going to be, how my legs are going to look, and so on and so forth. But if we say matter decides that thing, it doesn't make sense because matter can't think. Matter can't decide. Matter can love, can hate. So it doesn't naturally make sense. Okay. So mawufundi incwadi ka-Isaiah 44 verses 6 to 9, uNkulunkulu awubheke labantu, awubheke ubula balabantu. Umuntu uthatha isihlahla, uyahamba uyosika lesihlahla. After cutting down the tree, he carves the tree into a form. Mayiceda ukuyicarve lento into a form. Uyibonile, uyithatha izembe, uyakapa lesihlahla. Mayiceda ukusikapa, he starts to form this tree into an idol. Mayiceda ukuyenza into an idol, ayigcokise enye portion yale wood ayikhathile ayobasa ngayo umlilo, ne? Yeah, the same wood he makes an idol of. The other portion he makes fire. Uthi bheka uNkulunkulu ubula bomuntu, uthatha the one portion yale sihlahla wenza ngayo an idol, enye ubasa ngayo umlilo. Mayiceda loka othomela umlilo kangaka, on the other side he starts to bow down to this idol which he has just created from nature. Uthi bheka lento yenze uwe, you formed this thing with your own hands and you bow down to it eventually. That's idolatry. And unfortunately, God does not want us to move in that direction. When we begin to uphold evolution, it's a form of idolatry because that moves away the fundamental source of creation from being a theistic God into what we call evolution, the evolutionary process, or making everything pretty much materialistic or through matter. So matter being the foundation of everything that we see. Now, I want to further explain this whole thing so that is wakali. Now, this is what we call a triangle. Ne? A triangle. Now, this I'm trying to explain what's our science, but ukuze umuntu abe umuntu ophilayo uphila kanjani. So science tells us ukuthi umuntu or kuze kube khona what we call consciousness in matter. If we want to talk about consciousness in matter, they tell you that when neurons and protons come together, if there are thousands and thousands and billions of neurons, then they give rise to things like consciousness, which doesn't make sense. Absolutely doesn't make sense. So this is a triangle. If I have one triangle and I add more triangles, what then do I have? The emergent properties becomes more and more triangles, and simply just triangles. It's a simplified version of understanding what we are talking about. It's just triangles. The more triangles you have, it's just more triangles. You have nothing else but triangles because they are pretty much fundamentally metaphysical. There's nothing living about them, as Tandi, as Zondi, as Enzini. So the more triangles you have or the more chairs you put into one area, all you are going to fundamentally get is what is triangles or matter. Nothing more, nothing less. Okay, so John 1 verse 3 says, all things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. So all things are made by uNkulunkulu. And we continue to say the reality, according to Miller J. Erickson, Utiana, if reality is fundamentally physical, now walk with me, if reality is fundamentally physical, then the primary force binding it together is electromagnetic. Namuzutin. Uti, if isithi yonke into ivela kwi-matter, then the primary force that binds things together will then be electromagnetic, which makes sense. If, however, reality is fundamentally social, ngale ndlela engayo namhlanje, then the most powerful constituting force is that which binds persons together, namely love. So if the one thing that puts or that makes that creates this uniform or this relationship between abantu namhlanje is love, then principally that tells you that the source of the power that creates us would then need to be love itself, and God is love. Ultimately God is love. So if it's matter, then electromagnetic needs to put things together. But if it's not, then if it's consciousness or if it's fundamentally social, then then God or love really binds humanity together or binds life together. The fundamental constituting force is particles. If we're looking at matter, then it is matter in motion and namely matter. But if the fundamental constituting force is love, mainly social, then uNkulunkulu is the ultimate binding force of everything that exists in this world. And that fundamentally makes sense. Ngoba if you think about it, if matter, if protons and neurons gave rise to consciousness, it doesn't make sense because protons and neurons cannot think, cannot love, cannot hate. Something else needs to promote that, and matter cannot give rise to consciousness except for something supernatural. Okay, so the difference is like this. For something that is non-theistic, where there is no God, the constituting force will be electromagnetism, which means everything will be fundamentally material. It will be electrons, neurons, atoms, non-abstract protons, and atomic. That's how life is going to be if there is no God. I mean, then everything is just metaphysical. Yeah, you touch and feel, but it cannot feel, it cannot love, it cannot hate, and so on. But if we believe in what we call a theistic view of how the world exists, then the constituting force is love, and it's quite spiritual. Awazi ukuyithinta lento, but we know it exists. Mawuthi ngiyakuthanda ukhuluma into engabambeki, but you know it's a principle that holds everything. That's why love in itself cannot necessarily be a feeling, but it's a principle that that aligns things together. Okay, so when a theistic God is behind all that we see in this world, then it gives rise to something called consciousness. And consciousness, you can't touch it, you can't feel it. Propositional laws, in science, you can't touch them, you can't feel them, but you know they exist. You can't hold or touch or feel, but you know it exists. Hope, uthemba, you can't hold, you can't touch, you can't feel, but you know it exists. Trust, and these are things we can't do without. Trust, uthemba, faith, numbers, and I'll explain the concept of numbers just now. This is another thing that confuses scientists today. Mind, mind, I'm brain, I'm talking about the mind, both physical and spiritual laws of logic. Yeah, logic. And when you say something is logical, you're not referring to matter, but you're referring to something which is beyond metaphysical. Okay, so let me explain this concept of numbers quickly. Okay, what you see on the screen, it's the number 6. I don't know what you would be saying, but I would be worried if you said something else. So we are talking about numbers quickly. What you see here, but it's the number 6. And to be honest with you, it's not the number 6. What you are seeing here is a numeral that represents the number 6. So it's not the number 6. What you see on the screen is not the number 6, but it is a numeral that represents the number 6. That's why no more the Roman numerals, you also say it's number 6, but it's not necessarily number 6. It's a numeral. This is a Roman numeral that represents the number 6. This is a numeral we use that represents the number 6. Numbers exist, but scientists cannot tell you where numbers come from because you can't hold, you can't touch and feel, but you know that these thing called, or the terminology of this thing, or the existence of numbers is there, but you can't hold or touch or feel them, but you know they exist. I hope that makes sense. So awuthi mawuhamba estradini mawusahamba ubona abantu abayi-2 uthi naba they are walking in instances of two-ness number. You can't even see them, but you know there are 2 of them. So this whole concept of number exists. You can't mawuhamba estradini bese you trip over the number 2 or the number 6, but you know that numbers exist. Okay, I know it's quite tricky, but again, scientists are boggled by this thing called numbers. So again, who made us? This is what Voltaire says. We are intelligent beings. Intelligent beings cannot have been formed by a crude, blind, insensible thing. And that's what we've been mentioning all along. There is certainly some difference between the ideas of Newton and the dung of a mule. Newton's intelligence therefore came from another intelligence. Bazalwane, everything traces back to a form of intelligence. Think about it. Ukuthi umuntu ufika nje emhlabeni, there's something for him to eat. There are trees for him to eat. Kunendlela ukuthi umuntu aye toilet. Awucabanga nje ukuthi ngabonga nayibungu. I-waste yakho boyophuma kanjani. I thinking about all of this. So it really means there's some intelligence in how we were made or in how we were created. Hence everything fits perfectly. Bheka indlebe la ihlala khona, bheka ubuso la buhlala khona, bheka umlomo la ihlala khona. Umuntu uthi if God had not created the ears where they are, there would not be a need for a cell phone, because we can't listen through the ear and speak through the mouth. Again, just showing the power of God, how God puts everything into perspective and how God makes everything to make sense. Now let's look at the brain quite quickly. Now, ubuchopho. Now ngizokhuluma isiZulu, ne? Ubuchopho, there's a difference between ingqondo nobuchopho. There's a difference between the brain and what we call the mind. So brain is a ubuchopho, and brain is fundamentally matter. You can touch it. You can touch that gray matter. You can touch it. It's made of protons, neurons, and billions of neurons and protons. You can touch it. It's called the brain. What we call the mind, you can't touch. No one knows where the mind is, but we know there's what we call there's what we call the mind besides the brain, because the brain is fundamentally matter, but the mind is something we can't touch or feel, but we know it's there. As an example, I think or those who eat scopo. When you eat iskopo semvu, when you slice the kopo bemvu, or when you slice the head of a lamb, bese udla ubuchopho. Awuthi mawubhekile lo buchopho uthi mara lemvu benenzonde eningi ne, or lemvu yazi ngathi beyithanda kakhulu. You can't tell that by looking at ubuchopho bemvu, because it doesn't say anything. It cannot love, it cannot hate. A brain in itself cannot contribute or give rise to consciousness. It cannot, because by its nature it is matter. It's made up of protons, neurons, and whatsoever. So let's talk through a brain trivia quickly. So it says the average number of neurons in the brain equals to 100 billion. So we have 100 billion neurons in our brain. The adult brain weighs about 3 pounds. A newborn's baby's brain is as soft, as gooey as a tapioca pudding. The average number of glial cells in the brain equals to 10 to 50 times the number of neurons. So there are billions and billions of neurons, billions and billions of protons and so on in the brain yomuntu. All are matter. All are matter. The complexity of the brain contains approximately 100 billion nerve cells, which is also matter, neurons, and 10 to 50 times more supporting cells or glia. All of this, by the way, is still fundamentally matter. The complexity of the brain, this is according to Surgeon General, Uti, one of the most awe-inspiring mysteries of the brain science is how neural activity within the circuits give rise to behavior and even consciousness. It's a mystery to scientists themselves. Ne? But if you study the Bible, also understand that the Bible does not always refer to the brain. The Bible does not worry about the brain. Instead, the Bible always worries about the mind. So when you read the Bible, also Matthew 22 verse 37, Jesus says unto him, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy what? Brain. No, with all thy mind. For 1 Peter 4 verse 1, for as much then as Christ has suffered for us in the flesh, separating matter, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind, which is consciousness, for he that suffered in the flesh had ceased from sin. No? Separating matter from that's why you pull out there's the inner man. Okay, let's continue reading. Titus 1:15. Unto the pure all things are pure, but unto them that are defiled and unbelieving is nothing pure. But even their mind and conscience is defiled. It does not speak about the brain. So umuntu moshe kanje is because his conscience is messed up, not necessarily his brain. You can lose your mind, yes, but you can't lose your brain. Once you lose your brain, it's something else. But you can use your mind. Uyakwazi ukuthi lo muntu ngathi ulahlekelwe ingqondo, uthi ulahlekelwe ubuchopho. Okay? Ulahlekelwe ingqondo, meaning indlela orizina ngayo is wrong. And that reasoning does not come from ubuchopho. Even our language knows that. Philippians 2 verse 5, let this mind, not let this brain, no, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. That's what the Bible says. The Bible knows there's a separation of brain versus the mind. Romans 7:22, for I delight in the law of God after the inward man. The inward man, Romans 7:23, but I see another law in my body warring against the law of my mind. The Bible separates these two. There's the law of the body versus the law of the mind, and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members, meaning in my body. But Paul had to go to Romans 7 verse 24, oh wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from this body of death? Romans 7:25, I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then with the mind, I myself serve the law of God, but with the flesh, I serve the law of sin. There's a reason why scientists want us to focus on matter. There's a reason why they want us to look at matter as a substance of everything. I've gone through this. There's a reason why they want us to do that. Now, this is what some of the leading scientists have to say about the matter. Mind or how to write a proof. This is what he says. There are many researchers trying to understand consciousness, including philosophers since forever, neurophysiologists through MRI studies, cognitive psychologists through robotics, and no complexity theorists that I know of. And they are still looking into the mind, and I'm telling you, no one has come up with the evidence of the mind. Marco Biagini, he has a PhD in solid state physics. He says science has in fact proved that all chemical, biological, and cerebral processes consist only in some successions of elementary physical processes determined in their turn only by the laws of quantum mechanics. Such a view of biological processes does not allow to account for the existence of consciousness, which existence implies that the presence in man of an unphysical element. Such element being unphysical can be identified as the soul. Umuntu becomes a living what? A living soul through God breathing into him the breath of life to his nostrils. Okay, now we know that our brain is only a set of particles such as electrons, protons, interacting through electromagnetic field. On the other hand, every materialistic attempt to explain the existence of consciousness implies that what suffers, what loves, what desires, feels, etc. in us are objects such as electrons, electromagnetic fields. The point is that objects can feel nothing at all. Objects cannot feel happiness, sadness, love, anger, self-awareness, etc. Science has proved that the equations of electromagnetic field are universal. They describe the electromagnetic field within our brain as well as within a copper wire or an atom. Ne? Or within an atom. Or within an atom. Where am I? Atom. There is no trace of consciousness. Because, yeah. Did we go off? I'm just seeing something here, guys. Sorry.
No, we're still here.
You're still there. Okay. Uti, we have no trace, very important. There is no trace of consciousness, sensations, emotions, etc. in the equations of physics. We were saying there are many researchers trying to understand consciousness in all of these other, but ultimately they seem to all agree that there is no trace of consciousness, sensations, emotions, etc. in the equations of physics. Physics meaning metaphysical things or matter in that sense. So everything. Now there's a reason why Satani wants us to focus on matter being the basis of how things were made or being the basis of how things were created. Because Satani wants us to focus on things that matter and not necessarily God. He wants us to focus on things that matter. We are too busy with the things that matter. Today we look at exterior. Today we focus on things, man-made boxes. Today we are chasing waterfalls. Today we've made preachers into idols. Ngobumuntu does not want to think about a theistic God whom we can't feel or touch or hold, but we know he's the very existence of everything that fits around us. Namhlanje umuntu wants to worship things they can see and not things that they can't see. But after going through this, you begin to realize that everything that speaks about our very existence is things we cannot touch. Love cannot be touched. Hope cannot be touched. Faith cannot be touched. All these things exist in the things that we cannot see, but we know they are there. Why is it then that the devil drives us to metaphysical things? Because he wants us to worship idols. He wants us to worship things that don't, he wants us to worship things we can feel, touch, and hold, because he does not want us to worship a God whom we cannot see. And really, when you study the Bible, everything is based on this theistic God whom we cannot see, but there's evidence all around us. There's evidence all around us that tells us of God's love. Kodwa namhlanje we're a lot of wannabes. Noma umuntu afuna ukuba yinto, ufuna ukuba yinto ayibonile, things that he can be able to touch and feel and hold. That's why people want to be like Beyonce's. People want to be like whoever, because they are all physical. When the Bible simply tells us that we need to be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect, through a principle that we cannot hold or touch, through the principle called love. That's what God is calling us towards, and not this whole thing of evolution, because the evolution theory is a trick Satan to move away from a God we cannot see. That's his trick. That's his trick. And for as long as it is always taught in the world today, our minds will always move away from God, and our minds will always be focusing on the things we can hold, touch, feel, and hold. That's why namhlanje mawukhuluma ngothando, umuntu uthando is things they can hold. Yeah, mangithanda uzongithengela ini, mangithanda uzongithumela ini, mangithanda uzobonakala Valentine's Day, and so on. The principle of love in itself no longer exists in the fabric of mankind because of the evolution theory. Moved away from the existence of a theistic God, but more into the things we can hold, touch, and feel. All of what we live today is fundamentally idolatry. Idolatry. Uthi umuntu uzavuka ekseni agijimela ibox. Oh, because I mean, Mr. The Queen is all. That thing has become your God. You must know, when you live life like that, that fundamental thing has become your God. It shapes how you behave. It shapes how you do things. It shapes how you think, move, and think. Well, we were made by God. We were made in his image. We were made to, nothing that was made without him. We think we move, we have our being because of God, and not up on the things that matter. Matter, to tell you the honest truth, does not matter. Matter does not matter. So why not matter? Because looks can be very deceiving. Yeah. Can't judge a book by its cover. What you see is not what you get. Intent in itself is not physical, and science cannot determine that, because intent, that's why God judges our motive, our motives, and not our intent. Sometimes the things you see are not necessarily the things you get. So intent is also not physical. The battle is not physical itself, it's a spiritual battle. We are in a spiritual battle against principalities and forces that are beyond our comprehension. We can't touch them, we can't hold them. It's not made of flesh and blood. They all around us. We cannot fish, we cannot touch, we cannot hold. So the very substance of holding on to matter makes you non-realistic. So the reality, when we talk reality is things we cannot see. The reality is things we cannot see. So avoid saying I am kulumi reality. No, actually the reality is that things we cannot see. If you really want to focus on what reality is the things you cannot see. And character is heaven bound and not the body. When you look at it, that's why because these has been holding on to death far too long, and these very bodies have become the matter that we saw holding on to. The knowledge of God keeps the mind sane. It does not keep the brain sane. You are more than a brain and a body. You are God's creation. And what more can I say? John 3 verse 16, for God so loved the world. God so loved the world. The principle, the binding force, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. Namhlanje, eternal life is not guaranteed through evolution. And I've come to tell you that eternal life is guaranteed through you believing in a theistic God, a monotheistic God, not many, but oyedwa, who created the world and who gave us both observational evidence or science and both historical science as evidence of his creatorship. Everything we see in this world today is evidence that we serve a mighty God who is both supreme and I get and I know I've received many questions. Okay, I'm getting into the questions thing. So may the Lord bless the reading of his word. Amen.